Joining me on the line right now from Washington, D.C. is Frank Gaffney, the founder and president of the Center for Security Policy. Frank, good to have you back.
Good to be with you, Lars. Thank you.
So Donald Trump has attacked NATO by suggesting, A, we don't need it, or B, if we have it, we should be paying less of the bill and have our European friends pay more of the bill. You think he's wrong on both counts?
I think it would always be nice to have our allies pick up more of the tab, and I think we should be pressing them to do so. I think that we're there, and we're expending resources for our own security needs, not simply protecting theirs. And I think he's wrong, absolutely, on the issue of whether we can simply dismantle this institution at this particular moment in time. It would very much be appreciated by Vladimir Putin, who he seems to be going to some lengths to, romance, I guess. But I think it would be an absolute strategic disaster, and I would very strongly recommend against it.
Do you think, if his point is that NATO's original purpose was to answer the Soviet threat, clearly we still have a threat from the Soviet Union, and I agree with you on that. But is perhaps its formation, and before we get to the issue of who pays the bill, is the way that it's set up suited to the modern day threats that we face, other than, say, the Soviet Union and China?
I think the thing that's really distinctive about it, Lars, is basically that we are the dominant nation in it. And as a result, we largely call the tune. Not entirely. It's a consensus organization. But when we exercise leadership, it generally does what we want it to do. And I think that's a very valuable thing at a time where we're not only facing, as I mentioned, Putin, his acts of aggression, and I'm not just talking about Ukraine, which is the most obvious example, or what he's doing to sort of upend things in the Middle East to his satisfaction and our detriment. I'm talking about the threats that he's making to NATO members, including quite regularly now nuclear threats. That is to say, the threat to attack NATO allies with nuclear weapons. This is a real danger, I think, because it could well translate into a crisis that nobody wants, but that is extraordinarily dangerous. So I think for all of these reasons, if we didn't have NATO at the moment, we'd be trying to set something up that would probably look a lot like it. Then there's this other problem, which we talk about most weeks, of course, and that is that in addition to all these other sort of not so different threats from those of the Cold War, you have something that is now increasingly ominous, and that is the threat of jihad in Europe. Again, jihad that will not likely remain confined to it, but will reach here more and more, especially if we abandon Europe. So for all these reasons, I think this is just a misbegotten idea by somebody who I'm afraid hasn't really thought it through.
Well, I you know that I support Donald Trump, but I do think he's wrong in terms of taking apart NATO. I do take his point that while it's nice to be the biggest player and to call the tune most of the time, I do think that it's incumbent on the other members to hold up their share of the burden. I don't know that there's a country on earth right now that isn't up against some financial constraints. And the United States being one of them, most of the European countries are under some kind of financial pressure. And even Saudi Arabia is facing, pressure. So, I guess I'm just wondering, why can't we simply say to these other NATO members, you need to pick up your share of the bill, and if you're not willing to do that, we're not willing to do it either? Is this perhaps just a bargaining strategy by a presidential candidate?
Well, I don't know. You probably have a better fix on what he's thinking than I do. But
I doubt it. But
I will say this, Lars. Look, I had the opportunity 3 decades ago to serve President Reagan, as you may remember, in a job that, among other things, involved leading something called the High-Level Group, which was a NATO-wide organization focused on nuclear capabilities and deterrence. And in that particular domain especially, there weren't at the time, 15, 16 other nations that had comparable responsibilities because only three of us had nuclear forces. So I think what we want to do is we want to have the kind of deterrent to all kinds of aggression that our allies and we can mount. And yes, everybody should do their share. And, we set that bar back in the Cold War at 3%, as I recall, of GDP that had to be spent on defense. Many of them failed to live up to it even during that period of obvious danger. We should be pressing them. I just don't think that it's in our interest to say if they don't, and some of them won't, quite frankly, we're out of here. And I think we agree that that's a mistake on Donald Trump's part.
Do you think it's realistic to say to them, if you're not willing to do that, then the umbrella of protection for you, obviously you get some effect, because if the United States says we will stand up against both Russia and against China and against Iran, if one of these days we have a president who will stand up against Iran, we don't currently, that they would take that
sure.
They would take that seriously and say, we're not willing to have our citizens fund this entire bill, because it suggests that these other countries say, oh yeah, we're happy to take the benefit, we're just not willing to pay the bill.
Lars, it is a sensible thing to strive for, and I'm fully on board with it. I'm also simply saying that I think it remains in our interest not to have another conflagration on the continent of Europe. Think of what we spent in lives, to say nothing of national treasure, in the previous two conflagrations that they got themselves into when we weren't engaged. So I think there's a danger here of being penny wise and pound foolish. But look, this fundamentally comes down to American leadership. If we're serious about both being engaged there and in calling the tune, I think most of them will shape up and do better. If we allow them to either become convinced that Putin is the rising force with whom they better make, come to terms, a separate peace, if you will, not only aren't they going to be paying their fair share, they're going to be working for a guy who has neither their interests nor ours at heart. So, and that, again, leaves aside the jihadists. Those are folks who are coming, I believe, for us as well as for them. This is about taking down the free world. We need to be shoring up the institutions that help protect it, not taking them apart.
It just seems feckless on their part to say, we don't see the problem. We don't see the need to spend our money. You go ahead and spend your money. We'll enjoy the benefits of that. It's a very selfish point of view. And we used to be a very wealthy country. And Frank, as you and I have talked, one of the other big threats to our country is our now almost $20 trillion debt. If we talk about other countries like Greece being bankrupt, the United States, at least on paper, now owes more money than the entire output of the country for a year. So I see that as a problem as well. But Frank, thank you very much, and I agree with you that we should keep NATO. I'd just like the other folks who benefit from it to actually pay some of the tab or pay their fair share. Frank Gaffney, the founder and president of the Center for Security Policy,